introduce next Karl Zimmermann from the class of the '61 Boys School, who's going to introduce our next person. And I'd also like to say, as Karl Zimmermann comes up, Karl has been incredibly active in the school. And for anybody who's had the opportunity to look at, for one example of many, the 125th anniversary booklet, that's one of Karl's great works. And in working through that and having the opportunity to know Karl, I just want to, before you come here, thank you for how much you continue to do for all of us here at the school. Karl, thank you very much.
On an ordinary June morning, just less than a year ago, I finished my coffee, then, as usual, walked into my office to check email. I clicked on AOL and saw a familiar face and stunning, devastating news. I sat a moment, trying to take it in, then walked to the kitchen to tell Laurel, my wife.
Could you sit closer to the mic so we can hear you better? Thank you.
Sorry. Better?
Yeah.
Though it's Anthony Bourdain on the covers of his many, many books, memoirs, novels, cookbooks, and is headlined in his 4 television series, to me, he will always be Tony, my English student at the Englewood School for Boys. And he was also Tony to his millions of fans around the world who were as heartbroken as Laurel and I last June. CNN, the channel that aired Anthony Bourdain's Parts Unknown, the last of his acclaimed food and travel series, has assembled Anthony Bourdain Remembered, a beautiful, bold book, just published, of photographs and hundreds of tributes, most from ordinary people, the people that Bourdain championed, but also many from acclaimed chefs, and one from the former President of the United States. Eccentric, quixotic, rebellious, irreverent, certainly pushing boundaries of hair length, dress, and much more. Tony was not the model student at ESB, but luckily for me, even back then, he saw the point of English class, so we got along fine. However, it was probably just as well I wasn't tapped as advisor to Guerrilla, an underground newspaper of which he was tri-editor. Originally in the class of '74, he did summer work and graduated in 1973, going on to Vassar, where he'd stay for 2 years before leaving to begin a kitchen career, finding his calling as a 1978 graduate of the Culinary Institute of America. For the next, sometimes dark, decades, Tony struggled with drug addiction while working his way through many kitchens, including New York City's Coco Pazzo Teatro, the Supper Club, 1/5, and Ed Sullivan's, where he was a much admired executive chef, and then finally to Les Halles, where he was again executive chef, and it's the restaurant I think that he is most associated with. In retrospect, all of this, the good and the bad, could be considered research. After Tony left ESB by then Dwight-Englewood, I didn't see him again until with Malcolm Duffy, another of Tony's English teachers, Laurel and I dined at Ed Sullivan's. He came out to greet us with effusive thanks for our role as his English teacher. He said that in print more than once too. I can't pretend not to be flattered. But the only credit I can possibly take in the shaping of his prodigious writing skills is that I didn't mess them up and I didn't dumb them down. By the time we met at Ed Sullivan's, he published 2 monster-themed novels, Bone in the Throat and Gone Bamboo. Tony's life changed dramatically with the 2000 publication of Kitchen Confidential, Adventures in the Culinary Underworld, which grew from a piece in the New Yorker. It became a runaway bestseller, with over 1 million copies now in print. If you haven't read it, do. Funny, Insightful, deeply honest, self-revelatory, it fully deserves its fame and readership. So Tony became a rock star chef, and then the role in which he's best known today, a television journalist, writer, and host of A Cook's Tour for the Food Network, The Layover, and Anthony Bourdain, No Reservations for the Travel Channel, and finally, Parts Unknown for CNN, altogether spanning the years 2001 to 2018. Quite a run. For Tony, television and writing were symbiotic. A Cook's Tour started as a book and became both. In the middle of the 7-year run of No Reservations came a companion book, mostly photos, but with plenty of Tony's fine writing. It's still a new life, he wrote about the show, completely unlike my old one. A dream, a little boy's fantasy of a job. Series by series, step by step, Tony's work morphed from being a food show with travel to a travel show with food. Always food, but with great humanity. Barbecue may not be the road to world peace, but it's a start, he famously said in the Parts Unknown segment in Libya, no doubt his most dangerous shoot. In Medium Raw, A Bloody Valentine to the World of Food and the People Who Cook, a 2010 sequel of sorts to Kitchen Confidential, he remarked on, quote, my somewhat distorted view of myself as secretly a gentleman. I vote yes, though he was both profane and sardonic in his persona. He was both bold and vulnerable, completely honest about himself, and expected that in others. We now know that the beauty and compassion he brought to us came at great personal cost. If I'm an advocate of anything, Tony said, it's to move, to walk in someone else's shoes, or at least to eat their food. Today's world, where the poor, less developed countries to which he routinely traveled often are misunderstood and disrespected, the loss of Anthony Bourdain's voice is truly tragic. I'll leave the last words to chef and writer Tom Colicchio, a chef and writer just as Tony was. And I warn you in advance, for some reason they always make me tear up. Tony's restless spirit, he wrote, will roam the earth in search of justice, truth, and a great bowl of noodles. So Tony Bourdain, a great loss last year. And I'm glad I had a chance to share my thoughts about him. And now I will call up his brother, Chris, class of 1977, to accept the award for Tony. Chris and I, in our days at Dwight-Englewood, were actually fellow ferroequinologists. If anybody here knows what that is, you can come up at the end and claim the prize. That's yet to be devised. Thank you.
I've told various people before preparing to be here today, it's rather conflicted for me to be here. I mean, it's my first time back here in many decades. Most of the buildings I see around me did not exist when I was here. It's been very nice to find Karl and his wife Laurel again after many, many decades. I've always somehow thought of you as a friend all these years, even though we hadn't seen each other, and you were out there, and you were enjoying wonderful train rides and writing about them. And Karl has been inspiring travelers for far longer than my brother did. Karl's been writing travel articles and so on for over 50 years, I think. And I also got a chance to meet my very favorite teachers who are here, Jean Waitoa and Doris Gelman, who were among my favorites. But it also sucks to be here because Tony should be here. I should not be here. Tony should be here. And there was no obvious candidate to sort of take this for him. As you may know, you can read all about him in Google. You can Google him and get his life story. So he was all but legally divorced when he died last year, and so there were not a lot of obvious candidates. By rights, his daughter Ariane should have this. I'm planning at some point in the future to give it to her. I have not been able to see her for a while. I won't bore you. It's been very sad for my wife, Jennifer, and me, because we love our niece, Ariane. She's a little bit like Tony. She's 12. She's unconventional. She is creative. She's very, very funny. She does better than him in school. But she's a wonderful girl, young woman. And my plan is I will give this to her someday. I may let my mom keep it in her apartment for a couple of years in the meantime. And then if Ariane decides I don't want that, I may put it in the American Express Centurion Lounge at JFK, because I figure Tony probably spends more time there than anywhere else on his planet. That's, 18 years or so. But thank you for preparing this, Marie. Thank you for working with me on correcting some of the small factual errors and things like that. Thank you for abiding my picky editing. I want to talk a couple of things. Made some comments on suicide and holiness and journalism. One of the things that amazed me when Tony committed suicide last year is I was getting letters and emails and stuff from out of the blue, and colleagues I barely knew. I work at a Swedish company. People emailing me from Finland and from Sweden. How many people have had suicide in their lives, in their families, in their close social sphere? And it's just kind of buried, and you don't talk about it. And when you have friends and relatives die of cancer or a car accident or whatever, you can sit at a table and you can talk about that. And you say, oh yeah, I was so sad his uncle died of cancer, or did you hear so-and-so? It was a car accident, it's horrible. With suicide, it's just sort of, the eyes look down, people look away, people kind of mutter, my sister killed herself, or so-and-so's whatever. People do not talk about it, which surprised me, and I was just surprised how common it is. I became personally acquainted with suicide shortly after graduating from here. One of my own personal best friends, growing up and being here, Hal Osterwald, some of you may remember, committed suicide when he was, I think, around 20. His case and my brother Tony's case were quite different. Hal, from what I could tell, had planned it for many, many months, quite meticulously, left notes, things like that. My brother, best as I can reckon, was in some sort of burst of rage, and I think he had what some people might call a dissociative moment, and decided that the only solution at that moment was to kill himself. I will never know, no one will ever know. But everything I know about him and everything people who were much closer to him in recent years than I was suggests to me that if he had thought about it for about 12 seconds, he never, ever would have done it. But there you go. But I just find it surprising that people just bury it, they don't talk about it. It's so common, it's everywhere. And it's as common as cancer is, as common as car accidents, and unfortunately in this country, shootings and opioid addictions and other social ills. I suspect it's because in the Western religions, it is viewed as a sin. I think that's part of it. I think most Christian traditions in what I guess is the period formerly known as AD, view it as a sin. You were murdering yourself, you were killing yourself, you were making a decision that's only for God. So it's a sin, and I think that's part of it. For centuries, be buried in consecrated ground, suicide. I think Judaism is down on suicide, as far as I understand. Islam does not like suicide either. So I think there's sort of a shame element in it, and I think more than that, I think unlike other forms of death that our friends and relatives go through, I think we all feel that somehow we could have done something, and that's very different. If you have somebody you love who dies of cancer, who gets hit by a car, you don't come away thinking, oh, if only I could have done something. And I think with suicide, everybody around who's close to that person feels, if only I'd known, were they suffering? Were they thinking about this a long time? Could I have said something? I should have been there. I didn't do enough to protect them. I didn't I heard this from many of Tony's closest colleagues who traveled with him, who were his, what I've described as his band of buddies, because it was really amazing, the camaraderie that he had with the people who went with him on these shoots for 10 days at a time. And these were people he loved and protected, and who loved him and protected him. And I've heard that from many of them. I should have done something, I didn't protect him enough. And I think that's why there's sort of a shame element in it on both sides. And I think that's perhaps why people just don't discuss it. So I would have to say I was not given that choice. If I had a normal family, maybe I would have been one of these people who kind of went away muttering quietly, like, oh, yeah, and my brother, you know, and I would only tell close friends or whatever so many people do. Unfortunately, I didn't have that luxury. It's all over the damn internet for all of last summer. And so I just came to realize that, like, why are we all hiding this? Why are we not talking about this? Doesn't mean we can cure it, doesn't mean we can solve it, but it just, you know, I mean, my brother died, he killed himself. And there you are. Other people have relatives and friends, they kill themselves. Many different reasons, some will never know. But it shouldn't be buried, it shouldn't be an article of shame. I think in some of the Eastern religions, there's a slightly different attitude. I think that like in Buddhism, in Northern Asian and Northeast Asian Buddhism, and Southeast Asian Buddhism, there's a little bit of disagreement. Some think it's a sin, you're murdering yourself. Others think, well, it's a temporary interruption in your cycle of reincarnation, but not necessarily a sin. One thing I think they do agree on, though, in that religion is whether or not it's a sin. It's not something that you should do repeatedly. So, I want to talk about holiness. Tony and I, since we were sentient humans, Tony and I have been members of the same worldwide faith community. It is a very inclusive, welcoming, and probably the most peaceful faith community. We're atheists. And Tony probably was much stronger in that faith than even I am. And yet, what's so peculiar with Tony is, I mean, I certainly started to notice later in his second series, No Reservations, a lot of holiness started coming out of this guy. And I think where I first noticed it most strongly, he did a show in Laos, I think it was in 2008. And this was where you really started to see changes in some of his programming, because it had started when he first got his first program, his tour. You know, the producers were egging him on and saying, okay, Tony, you know, show them that you can try something really weird, and, you know, eat bugs on camera. And people loved that, of course, ate it up, but Tony did not actually really love those moments. It was kind of being, well, hey, comedy gold, we gotta make this popular. When he started to get more creative control of his second series, No Reservations, he started to see his own artistry and what he was trying to get across come out. And in his Laos show, I think it was exemplary, one of the early ones that started to really started to see what he was getting at. You know, you're watching what should be a food show, and okay, we're gonna go Laos. But somewhere folded in there, Tony reminded those of us who are old enough, or told people who did not remember, that basically the US was secretly conducting a war on Laos, an uninvolved, non-combatant whole country during the Vietnam War, and basically bombing the shit out of it for years. We dropped more bombs on Laos in a few years than all bombs dropped in World War II, and this was not even a country technically involved in the war. And people are still today, in 2019, walking around getting blown up by munitions that were dropped in the 1960s by the American Air Force. And Tony put that into his show. And one of the, you know, usually in Tony's show, the format was he would kind of find 3 or 4 different places to go, different types of things to see, different food experiences to share with locals and make them open up in some way. And he got better and better and better at it. And in that one, he ended up in the hut of some Laotian who lives in a hut with no electricity, out in the middle of nowhere, don't know. That guy had had his legs blown off by an American mine years after the conflict ended. And he's there welcoming this American traveler with his camera crew in his hut and making him dinner. And I remember Tony asked him at some point, you know, can you forgive Americans for do this. And the guy said, yes, I forgive Americans for doing this. And I started to see in that show there is a holiness in this programming. There's something unbelievably, I don't know, sacred in a way in some of his programs, because they're getting you past ignorance, they're getting you past hatred. One of the earliest definitions and logical definitions of the word nirvana, it's a Sanskrit term. It means extinguishment. It means extinguishment of ignorance. It means extinguishment of hatred and extinguishment of suffering. And this is what you started to see more and more in Tony's shows. And you started to see him going to places like Iran and showing all of us, these are not bad people. These are not inherently evil people. He would go to places that had been torn by war for a century, Congo. He was wandering around up in the northeast Congo. There's been a civil war for years and a colonial war with Belgium before that in the 50s. And talk to normal people, bring you into their houses, bring you into what's going on with them. He went to Haiti after the hurricane. And I personally went to hear the Dalai Lama speak in Central Park, I don't know, 25 years ago. We all have seen the Pope's messages at Christmas or at Easter or whatever. And these are globally respected religious leaders who will stand out there and remind us and exhort us to remember people who've lost their homes in hurricanes, people who've been suffering from war, people who have suffered in some way that are from poverty, and that we should remember them, we should be gracious to them, we should respect them. Tony brought you into those people's houses and had dinner with them. We all were there. We were all talking to them in person. It wasn't just a matter of some guy talking once a year in a pulpit or giving a speech somewhere, or like some of Tony's CNN colleagues, even who were reporters, they fly in and stand on a rooftop in Beirut at a hotel and report for 12 hours. Oh, there's bombing going on over there, and years ago, whatever. Tony would go into houses of the people who'd been bombed for weeks and weeks and weeks and have dinner with them. And I think that's an amazing thing. There's an unspoken mission there of holiness and extinguishing ignorance and extinguishing hatred. I think I'd like to end just talking about journalism for a moment, because I mean, to Peter's point earlier, journalism is under assault. What is journalism? What should journalism be? There's disagreement in a lot of countries. I'm lucky enough to have learned French rather well here, and I did manage to get some time in France in college as well. And I mean, in a lot of Europe, everybody knows newspapers are biased. There's the socialist newspaper, and there is the right-wing newspaper. I mean, everybody's kind of attuned to that. In this country, we've theoretically had a tradition that newspapers and journalism should be objective, and they should be telling us things as they are. Obviously, we all know that can't be reality all the time. The interesting thing about Tony, here was an atheist who I found more holy and more sacred than most religious people I've met and seen. Here was a guy who never called himself a journalist. He said, I'm a chef, or later on he said, I write TV shows, I'm an author. He never called himself a journalist. And yet, I think he was one of the best journalists in our history of this country. And I think the secret sauce, it's my theory, but I think the secret sauce is, if I know kind of how his show works, and they would typically put feelers out for a local handler, like we want to do a show in Armenia. They would find somebody in Armenia, I don't know how, they would sometimes advertise or go through media companies there, and they would find people and they'd say, well, we want to come and do 6 days in Armenia, we want to shoot 3 or 4 locations, can you find us these types of things and introduce us to these types of people? So they would kind of set it up that way. But I just started to think, well, what about the people on the receiving end of this? So if I got a call from someone and said, oh, an American reporter wants to come and talk to you, there's a lot of baggage with that, and maybe I would say no. Or, oh, an American congressman wants to come and do a field trip and investigate what's going on. Or a preacher, or an almost no matter what. You immediately associate that with some kind of baggage. They're trying to come and prove a point, they're trying to come in with a preconception of some kind and prove their preconception. And I think what's so amazing about Tony is, okay, they're calling up saying, hey, this really interesting guy who likes to write about food and travel experiences wants to come and share an interesting meal with you or hear from you about this place or this what's been going on and have lunch with you. Or have, in some cases, literally, like, can your mom cook for him at your house? Literally. In his Indian program, one of his Indian programs, there was, as I recall, some Raja who personally cooked some curry for Tony, sitting there in his palace, like a story, curry. I think it's because he never called himself a journalist that he was one of the best journalists ever, because he got people to open up. He would show up and share meals with them. They would just talk to him. They'd see this is a no bullshit guy. And I mean, I can tell you what you saw on the screen with Tony. That is the way he is. It was. That was no bullshit. That's how he was. That's how he talked. That's how he thought of stuff. Sometimes his crew would like roll their eyes because off camera they say, "Oh, can't you please shut up?" You know, because he was that way all the time. But I think it's because he didn't call himself a journalist. He ended up being one of the best journalists in American history and showing us reality more than many people who call themselves reporters, but you know, are helicoptered into a rooftop in Beirut for 10 hours and then run out and tell you they've reported on the situation. Tony Bourdain brought us there, brought us to people's houses, got us to see these are good people, these are people who deserve respect. The guy who runs the food stall in Manila is just as worthy of respect as the guy who runs the French Laundry restaurant in California. And I think that was one of the more miraculous things about Tony that helped him to be such a holy man and really one of the best journalists ever. He was amazing and a truly unique person. I was not terribly close with him in the last few years. I miss him terribly, and I think everybody should miss him terribly, and I hope people keep watching his programs forever. Keep him going.